Welcome to this collection of chilling tales, designed to accompany you through the quiet hours of the night. This video is set to a black screen with the soothing sound of gentle rain, perfect for those who seek a peaceful ambience to drift off to sleep. But be warned, these stories, though quiet and calming on the surface, echo with the eerie truths of the wilderness. Each tale unfolds a mystery, a glimpse into the secrets hidden within shadowy forests, unmarked trails, and the primal forces that linger just beyond the edge of understanding. They're stories of the unknown, whispered warnings of the things that watch, wait, and hunt when the world grows still. Let the rain carry you into sleep if you can, but remember, the forest has its own rhythm, its own voice, and sometimes it speaks to those who dare to listen. The storm had rolled in faster than expected. Parker Mason, a seasoned park ranger, had just finished his final patrol of the season when the downpour started. By the time he reached the ranger station, the sun had already dipped below the tree line, and the dense forest surrounding him was swallowed in darkness. The radio crackled with static, no connection to headquarters. Typical. Parker sighed, locking the door behind him. The cabin was sturdy enough, with thick wooden walls and reinforced windows, built to withstand nature's fury. He started a fire in the stone hearth, its light casting flickering shadows on the walls. The warmth was comforting, but it couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over him during his patrol. It started with the deer. He'd come across a small herd, standing unusually still on the main trail. Their eyes locked onto him, unblinking, as if trying to convey some urgent message. When he waved his flashlight, they didn't flinch. Instead, they turned in unison and disappeared into the underbrush without a sound. Now, alone in the cabin, Parker tried to rationalize it. Animals acted strangely sometimes, changes in weather, predators nearby. Nothing new, but it didn't explain the tracks he'd found further along the trail. Massive prints, too large for a wolf, too deliberate to be a bear. They'd led to the edge of the trail and then vanished, as if the creature had taken flight. A low growl pulled Parker from his thoughts. He froze, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. It came again, louder this time, from somewhere outside. Grabbing his flashlight and rifle, he moved cautiously to the window. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating the tree line. At first, there was nothing, just the storm hammering the leaves. Then he saw them, a pair of glowing eyes, low to the ground, reflecting the light like twin orbs. The eyes were fixed on the cabin. Parker's grip tightened on the rifle. He'd encountered wolves before, but this felt different. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They just stared. "Get out of here!" he shouted, banging the butt of the rifle against the windowsill. The sound echoed through the forest, but the eyes didn't budge. Parker stepped back, heart pounding. He forced himself to breathe, to think. Whatever it was, it couldn't get in. The cabin was secure, the door bolted, the windows reinforced. But as he turned away, another growl echoed through the night, this time from the opposite side of the cabin. He spun, sweeping the flashlight toward the back window. Another pair of eyes, and then another, and another. Parker's stomach dropped. He counted 5 sets of eyes now, all surrounding the cabin, all staring unblinking through the storm. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, backing toward the fireplace. He checked the rifle, fully loaded. The radio sputtered again, a burst of static and faint voices. He rushed to it, turning the dial, hoping for anything resembling help. Instead, a garbled phrase came through the noise. "Leave. Too late. Who is this? Hello? Can you hear me?" Parker shouted into the receiver. The static swallowed his voice. He slammed the radio in frustration. Outside, the growls grew louder, more insistent. The firelight flickered, and Parker turned to see a shadow pass by the window. It moved too fast to be anything natural, a blur of darkness that made his skin crawl. The animals weren't just watching, they were testing him. His mind raced. Could he make a run for the truck? No. The cabin was deep in the woods, and the path was treacherous even in daylight. He was trapped. The thought sent a cold wave of fear down his spine. Then came the sound that made his blood freeze, scratching. claws against wood, faint but deliberate, circling the cabin. They were probing, looking for a way in. Parker aimed a rifle at the door, heart hammering in his chest. "Stay back," he yelled, his voice cracking. The scratching stopped. Silence, save for the storm raging outside. Then, a deafening crash. Something hit the side of the cabin with such force that the walls shuddered. Parker stumbled backward, nearly dropping the rifle. He swung the flashlight toward the source of the impact, just as another crash came from the opposite side. They were ramming the walls now, testing the strength of the cabin. Panic set in. He couldn't fight off all of them, not if they got inside. Parker glanced at the fire, an idea forming. He grabbed a burning log with the fireplace poker, the flames licking the air. "If you want me, come and get me," he shouted, holding the makeshift torch high. Another growl, this one deeper, more guttural. Parker's flashlight beam caught movement outside the window. Something massive, covered in matted fur, with a face that was almost canine but distorted wrong. Its eyes met his, and for the first time, Parker felt pure primal terror. The creature didn't lunge. It didn't need to. Instead, it bared its teeth in a grotesque grin, as if savoring his fear. The scratching returned, now accompanied by a low, rhythmic growl that seemed to come from all sides. Parker's torch flickered, the flames sputtering as the storm's wind found its way through the cracks. And then the light went out. The forest fell silent once more, as if it had claimed its due and was content for now. But miles away, as campers gathered around a fire, their whispered tales would awaken something that was never meant to be disturbed in echoes in the pines. The fire crackled in the center of the clearing, casting long shadows across the pine trees. Her friends, Sarah, Dan, Emma, and Jason, sat in a loose circle, their laughter breaking the quiet hum of the forest. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, a chance to unplug and get away from the chaos of city life. Jason poked at the fire with a stick, sending a flurry of sparks into the air. "All right, who's got a scary story? Come on, we're in the middle of nowhere. It's practically a requirement." Emma rolled her eyes. "We're too old for campfire ghost stories, Jason." Dan smirked. "Says the person who screamed when a spider crawled into her tent last night." Emma threw a marshmallow at him. "That spider was huge, and you're still sleeping outside tonight." Sarah chuckled, pulling her jacket tighter as a chill crept through the clearing. "All right, I've got one. It's not a ghost story, though. It's about this area. Something my grandpa told me when I was a kid." Jason leaned forward eagerly. "Perfect. Let's hear it." Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking to the dark woods around them. "He used to say this forest is different, that sometimes it listens." Emma snorted. "Creepy. But forests don't listen, Sarah." "No, really," Sarah insisted, her voice lowering. "He said if you tell a story here, the forest might take it and make it real." Jason laughed. "Sounds like Grandpa was just trying to keep you from wandering off alone." "Maybe," Sarah said, her tone thoughtful. "But he always said it with this look, like he wasn't joking. I don't know. Maybe it's just one of those family myths." Dan clapped his hands. "All right, I'm sold. Let's test it out. Who's got a story for the forest?" Jason grinned. "I've got one. It's about a kid who got lost in the woods, not far from here, actually. People say he still wanders, looking for his way out." Emma groaned. "Seriously? That's the best you've got?" Jason ignored her, his voice dropping into a hushed, dramatic tone. His name was Charlie, 10 years old. He went camping with his family and wandered too far from the campsite. They searched for days, but they never found him. Some say he got turned around. Others think something in the woods took him. The wind picked up, rustling the branches overhead. Sarah glanced uneasily at the trees, but Jason pressed on. "They say if you're quiet, you can hear him calling for his mom. Crying. Always crying, because he can't find his way back." Emma yawned exaggeratedly. "Spooky. Can we go back to roasting marshmallows now?" Jason laughed, but Sarah's face remained tense. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The group fell silent, the crackling fire now the only sound. Jason grinned, ready to tease her for being jumpy. But then he heard it too, a faint sound drifting through the trees. A child's voice, soft, distant, calling, "Mom, Mom." Emma sat up straight. Jason, tell me that's a joke. Jason's grin vanished. It's not me. The voice came again, closer this time. Mom, where are you? Dan grabbed his flashlight, shining it into the woods. Is someone out there? Hello? The voice didn't respond, but the sound of footsteps echoed through the trees. Small, uneven steps crunching the pine needles. Mom, I'm scared. The voice wavered, filled with tears. Sarah's breath quickened. We shouldn't have told that story. Emma grabbed her arm. Stop. It's just someone else camping, right? Jason stood, his flashlight beam darting between the trees. Hey, kid, are you lost? Where's your family? The footsteps stopped. Silence settled over the clearing, the firelight flickering as the wind gusted again. Jason stepped closer to the edge of the woods. Kid, a low whisper carried on the wind. Help me. The voice was behind him now. Jason spun around, his flashlight shaking in his hand. This isn't funny. The fire sputtered, its light dimming as the shadows around them grew darker. Sarah's voice trembled. Jason, get back here. Before he could move, the sound of footsteps started again, this time faster, running. Branches snapped, the noise circling the clearing, closing in. The friends huddled together, their flashlights scanning the trees. Mom, Mom. The voice was louder now, desperate and raw. Dan cursed under his breath. We need to get out of here. Emma grabbed her backpack. Which way? We can't even see the trail. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the forest fell eerily silent. Then, from the edge of the clearing, a small figure stepped into the light. It was a boy, no older than 10, his clothes torn and his face streaked with dirt. His eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto Jason. Mom said you'd help me. Jason stepped back, his voice barely a whisper. You're Charlie. The boy's lips curled into a faint smile. She said you'd find me. She said you'd come. Before anyone could move, the boy's body twitched unnaturally, his limbs jerking as if pulled by invisible strings. His head snapped to the side, and his voice deepened, unnatural and guttural. Now you'll stay. The fire went out. Darkness swallowed the clearing, and their screams echoed through the pines. Their screams faded into the rustling trees, leaving only the sound of wind as witness. But deep in the Appalachians, a photographer's lens would capture far more than just the beauty of the wilderness in Predator's Call. The Appalachian wilderness was quiet, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Mark Ellis crouched in the undergrowth, adjusting the lens of his camera. He'd spent years photographing wildlife, chasing that perfect shot. Tonight, he was certain he'd found it. The tracks had led him here, massive paw prints too large for any wolf, too defined for a bear. Mark's heart raced as he followed them deeper into the woods. He'd heard the stories, of course, locals whispered about a predator, something ancient, roaming these mountains. Most dismissed it as folklore, but Mark's instincts told him otherwise. The faint sound of a howl broke the silence. Low, mournful, and resonating with a chilling, almost human undertone. Mark froze, his fingers tightening around the camera. He scanned the tree line, his flashlight casting long, shaky shadows. There was again a second howl closer this time. Mark's pulse quickened. He raised his camera, adjusting the focus as his breath fogged the crisp night air. Through the lens, he caught movement, a dark shape weaving silently between the trees. Click! The shutter snapped, the flash illuminating the forest for a brief second. In that moment, he saw it. A hulking figure, canine in shape but grotesquely exaggerated. Its eyes glowed like embers, locking onto him. Mark staggered back, his foot catching on a root. The camera hung around his neck, swinging wildly as he scrambled to his feet. The creature didn't charge. It stood there, watching, as if assessing him. Easy, easy, Mark whispered, his voice trembling. He stepped back slowly, his heart thundering in his chest. The creature tilted its head, the glow of its eyes intensifying. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it vanished into the darkness. Mark's breath came in shallow gasps. He had the proof, whatever it was, he had captured it on film. But the thrill of discovery was overshadowed by a gnawing sense of dread. Something wasn't right. The howl came again, louder this time, and from a different direction. Mark spun around, realizing with a sinking feeling that it wasn't alone. A second pair of glowing eyes emerged from the shadows, then a third. They were circling him, moving with an unnerving coordination. He reached for his radio, fumbling with the buttons. Static crackled. "Dispatch, this is Ellis. I need backup. Something's out here," he said, his voice shaking. No response, just more static. The eyes closed in, the creature staying just beyond the reach of his flashlight. Mark raised his camera again, snapping another shot. The flash revealed a blur of fur and teeth, a shape too fast to fully capture. The forest erupted with noise. Snarls and growls came from every direction, blending into a cacophony of sound that made Mark's blood run cold. He swung his flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing. Only the eyes, watching, waiting, and then silence. Mark's hand shook as he lowered the flashlight. The growls had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. He took a hesitant step forward, his boots crunching on the forest floor. A low, guttural sound came from behind him. He spun around, the flashlight beam landing on a single pair of eyes, closer now, impossibly close. The creature stepped into the light, revealing its full form. It was massive, its fur black as midnight, its face twisted into a grotesque snarl. But it wasn't the face of a wolf. It was something far older, far more primal. The creature let out a sound, deep and resonant, that made Mark's ears ring. It wasn't a howl. It was a call, vibrating through the air like an unspoken command. From the shadows, the others emerged. They moved as one, their glowing eyes fixed on Mark. He backed away, his legs trembling, until his back hit a tree. He raised the camera, snapping shot after shot, the flash illuminating the creatures for fleeting moments. The call came again, louder this time, reverberating in his chest. Mark clutched his ears, dropping the flashlight. In the darkness, he could feel them closing in, the air thick with their presence. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. The camera slipped from his hands, hitting the ground with a dull thud. The creatures didn't flinch. They advanced slowly, their eyes burning brighter, their snarls low and menacing. Mark's scream echoed through the forest, swallowed by the night. The camera lay on the ground, its lens cracked, the last image captured frozen in its memory, a blur of glowing eyes and fangs, and the shadow of a man moments before the darkness claimed him. The predator disappeared into the shadows, but not all creatures are free to roam. Hidden within a forgotten enclosure, a silence that was anything but natural would soon break in silent roar. The trail wasn't on any map. Liz Carter had stumbled upon it by accident while hiking in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was narrow, overgrown, and looked as though no one had used it in years. But something about it called to her, a pull she couldn't quite explain. Her boots crunched on the uneven ground as she pushed through the dense foliage. The air grew cooler, and the towering pines seemed to close in around her. Liz told herself it was just curiosity, the thrill of the unknown. But there was an unease she couldn't shake. After about an hour, the trail opened into a clearing. In the center stood an enormous iron gate, rusted and worn, half hidden by creeping vines. Behind it, Liz could make out the faint outline of tall metal bars. A cage. No, an enclosure. She stepped closer, her breath hitching as she saw the sign bolted to one of the bars. Southern Wildlife Sanctuary. Closed indefinitely. Liz's brow furrowed. She'd never heard of a sanctuary in this area, and she'd hiked these mountains her entire life. She pressed her face against the cold iron bars, peering inside. The enclosure was massive, sprawling deep into the forest. Thick undergrowth had reclaimed most of it, but there were signs of its former purpose. Concrete feeding stations, broken fences, and what looked like a dried-up pond. Then she saw it, a shadow moving among the trees. Liz's heart quickened. It was large, too large to be a deer or a black bear. She fumbled with her camera, aiming it at the enclosure. The lens focused on the shadow, which seemed to melt into the foliage. Click! The sound of the shutter echoed unnaturally loud in the silence. The shadow froze. For a moment, Liz thought she'd imagined it, but then it moved again, stepping into the faint light breaking through the trees. Her breath caught. It was a lion, or at least it looked like one, but something was off. Its body was leaner, its fur darker, almost black, and its eyes, they glowed faintly, even in daylight. Liz's mind raced. Lions didn't belong here, not in these mountains, not in this hemisphere. She lowered the camera, her legs trembling. The lion lifted its head, sniffing the air, and then its gaze locked onto hers. It didn't move, neither did she. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound broke the silence. A roar, but not the kind Liz had heard in documentaries. This was deeper, almost vibrating through her chest, and it carried an eerie, unnatural resonance. She stumbled back, her boot catching on a root. The camera slipped from her hands, hitting the ground. The lion didn't chase her. It simply stood there, watching. Then it roared again, and the air around her seemed to shift. The forest fell deathly silent. Not a bird, not an insect, nothing dared make a sound. Liz grabbed her camera and bolted. She didn't stop until she was far from the enclosure, her lungs burning and her legs aching. When she reached her car, she slammed the door shut and sat there, panting, her hands trembling as she clutched the camera. Curiosity gnawed at her on the drive home. The sanctuary, the lion, none of it made sense. She had to know more. That night, she scoured the internet for any mention of a wildlife sanctuary in the area. After hours of searching, she found a single, cryptic article from decades ago. The Southern Wildlife Sanctuary, it said, had been shut down after a series of mysterious incidents. The animals had started behaving strangely, aggressive, coordinated, almost as if they were being controlled. Several employees had gone missing, and eventually, the sanctuary was abandoned. The state deemed it too dangerous to reopen. Liz leaned back in her chair, chills running down her spine. She opened the photos on her camera. The images of the forest were clear, but when she reached the photo of the lion, her stomach dropped. It wasn't there. The frame showed the trees, the foliage, even the faint outlines of the enclosure, but no lion. Just empty space where it should have been. Her heart pounded as she flipped through the pictures again. The lion was gone from every shot, but she remembered it. She knew she'd seen it. The roar came back to her mind, its strange, resonant tone. She turned off the computer, trying to shake the unease that clung to her like a shadow. For days, she couldn't focus on anything else. The image of the lion haunted her, and the silence of the forest replayed in her head. Against her better judgment, she decided to return. She had to see it again, to prove she wasn't losing her mind. The trail was harder to find this time, as if the forest itself was trying to hide it. But eventually, she reached the clearing. The gate was gone. Liz stared, her heart racing. The enclosure was still there, but the massive iron gate had vanished, leaving no trace. She stepped closer, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. The forest around her was silent again. Then she heard it, that same deep, unnatural roar, louder this time, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Liz froze, her camera clutched tightly in her hands. The shadow appeared again, but this time, it didn't stay in the trees. It stepped out into the open, its glowing eyes fixed on her. And behind it, more shadows emerged. One by one, they came, large, dark forms, each with glowing eyes and that same unnatural presence. Liz took a step back, and the lion roared again. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was a command. The echoes of the roar died out, leaving the woods to reclaim their stillness. But on an unmarked trail, a lone hiker would soon discover that shadows have their own sinister paths in Trail of Shadows. The forest felt different today. Jared had been hiking the Appalachian trails for years, but as he ventured deeper into this unmarked path, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against your ears until every step on the pine needles seems deafening. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, glancing over his shoulder. Nothing but trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. Still, the feeling remained. Jared paused to check his GPS. The screen flickered. He tapped it, frowning as it failed to connect. It didn't make sense. This wasn't the most remote part of the range, and he'd never had issues before. He shook it off, telling himself it was a glitch. It wasn't like he could get lost. The trail was clear. At least it had been. Jared stopped short, his stomach nodding. The trail was gone. The dirt path he'd been following for the last 3 miles had vanished, swallowed by underbrush. He turned, retracing his steps, but the path behind him was just as obscured. Panic prickled at the edges of his mind. He checked his surroundings again, and that's when he noticed the footprints. They were large, larger than any humans, and unmistakably canine. The prints trailed ahead of him, weaving through the undergrowth. Jared crouched, running his fingers along the edges. Fresh. He straightened quickly, his pulse quickening. Wolves didn't usually attack humans, but these tracks weren't from any ordinary wolf. The size alone ruled that out. And then there was something else, a strange shape to the pads, as if the creature had claws longer and sharper than nature intended. He debated turning back, but the growing unease told him it wouldn't matter. He was already too far in. The forest grew darker as the sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched across the ground, twisting and shifting with every movement. Jared's flashlight cut through the gloom, the beam steady but unable to banish the oppressive darkness entirely. A howl pierced the silence, low and mournful, echoing through the trees. Jared froze. It was close, too close. He turned slowly, scanning the area. His light caught movement, a fleeting blur of fur and muscle disappearing into the shadows. His heart pounded as he gripped the flashlight tighter. "Hello," he called, his voice shaky. The forest offered no reply, only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Then came the second howl, from his left this time, followed by a third, and a fourth. Jared realized with dawning horror that the howls were moving, circling him. His hand went to the knife on his belt, the small blade offering little comfort. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself. "It's just wolves." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Wolves didn't move like this. They didn't surround prey without revealing themselves. They didn't feel this deliberate. The footprints appeared again, leading deeper into the forest. But as Jared followed them with his flashlight, they changed. The neat, canine prints grew distorted, the claw marks lengthening, the pad shapes warping into something unnatural. And then they stopped altogether. Just like the trail, they vanished, leaving no trace. A low growl came from behind him. Jared spun, the beam of his flashlight catching the gleam of eyes in the distance. Yellow, predatory, and glowing faintly in the dark. They blinked once, then another pair appeared beside them. And another. A chill ran down his spine as he realized he was surrounded. "Get back," he shouted, waving the flashlight. The eyes didn't move. They watched him, unblinking, as if savoring his fear. Jared backed away, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He stumbled over a root, catching himself just before he fell. The growling grew louder, a guttural symphony that made his ears ring. The flashlight flickered. Jared shook it frantically, but the beam grew weaker. "No, no, no," he muttered, desperation clawing at him. The light failed entirely, plunging him into darkness. Jared's breathing was ragged now. He fumbled for his phone, the faint glow of the screen barely illuminating the trees around him. The eyes were closer, the growling now mixed with the sound of movement. Slow, deliberate steps closing the gap. "Please," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was begging. "Please." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat. Then the shadows moved. A massive shape lunged toward him, its form impossibly fast, impossibly large. Jared screamed, raising his arms in a futile attempt to protect himself. The flashlight clicked back on, its beam cutting through the darkness just as the creature disappeared into the trees. Jared stumbled to his feet, his legs shaking. The glowing eyes were gone, the forest silent once more. He didn't wait to question it. He ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he crashed through the undergrowth. The path didn't matter anymore. He just had to get out. The howl started again, distant at first, but growing louder with each step he took. Jared pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his legs, the branches clawing at his face. Finally, the trees began to thin, the faint outline of the trailhead coming into view. He burst into the open, collapsing onto the gravel path. The howls stopped abruptly, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Jared lay there, gasping for air, his flashlight still clutched tightly in his hand. He looked back at the tree lean, half expecting the glowing eyes to reappear. But the forest remained still, its shadows unmoving. As he staggered to his car, Jared couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't escaped, that the forest had let him go, but only because it wanted to. And as he drove away, his headlights briefly caught a single set of footprints on the road behind him, large, distorted, and leading back into the woods. The trail faded into nothingness, leaving only the forest's breathless silence behind. In the hollow, however, cries too human to ignore would draw another into its depths and howl in the hollow. The first sound came just after dusk, a long, mournful cry that echoed through the hollow like the wail of a lost soul. Danny stiffened, his hand pausing mid-swing as he set up the tent poles. "Did you hear that?" he asked, turning to his sister, Lena, who was kneeling by the fire pit. She looked up, brushing dirt from her hands. "Probably a coyote. They're everywhere out here." Danny frowned. It didn't sound like a coyote. It didn't sound like anything he'd ever heard before. The cry came again, softer this time, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. "It's weird," Danny muttered. "It almost sounds human." Lena rolled her eyes. "We've been out here all day. Your brain's playing tricks on you. Focus on getting that tent up before it gets too dark." Danny tried to shrug it off, but unease gnawed at the edges of his mind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows in the hollow deepened, stretching long and jagged across the forest floor. By the time they got the fire going, the night had settled in, wrapping the clearing in a cocoon of stillness. Danny poked at the flames with a stick, watching embers dance into the air. Lena was rummaging through her backpack when the sound came again. Louder, closer. Danny froze, the stick falling from his hand. "That's not a coyote." Lena's face was pale in the firelight. She opened her mouth to respond, but the cry came again, cutting her off. It was a howl, but there was something wrong about it, something too high-pitched, too deliberate, as if it were mimicking a human voice. "Maybe it's an animal caught in something," Lena suggested, her voice shaky. "A trap or maybe it's not an animal," Danny interrupted. The words hung in the air, heavy with tension. They both turned toward the darkness beyond the firelight, the hollow's thick trees standing like silent sentinels. "Stay here," Danny said, grabbing his flashlight. Lena grabbed his arm. "Are you serious? If something's out there, we should be getting in the car, not playing hero." Danny hesitated. She was right, but the sound didn't feel like something they could ignore. It could be someone hurt. What if it's a kid? Lena's grip tightened. "If it's a kid, we'll call for help." "But Danny, that doesn't sound like anything we should mess with." Another howl, closer now. This time it was unmistakable. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a call. Danny and Lena exchanged a look, their shared fear unspoken but understood. The fire seemed smaller now, its glow barely reaching the edges of the clearing. The forest erupted with sound, low growls, snapping branches, and that same eerie howl, now layered with other noises, snarls, clicks, even faint laughter. It was coming from all directions, surrounding them. Danny swung the flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the trees, but revealing nothing. "Hello," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Who's out there?" The sound stopped. Silence fell so abruptly it was suffocating. Danny took a step back, his flashlight shaking in his hands. Then the voice came, soft, pleading, and chillingly familiar. "Danny, help me." He froze, his blood turning to ice. It wasn't just a voice. It was his mother's voice. "Mom," he whispered, his throat dry. "Mom, is that you?" Lena grabbed his arm again, harder this time. "Stop it, Danny. It's not her. It can't be her. But the voice came again, closer. Danny, please. I'm lost. Tears welled in his eyes as he turned toward the sound. His mother had died 2 years ago, but the voice was unmistakable. It carried the same warmth, the same gentle lilt. It's her, he murmured, stepping toward the tree lean. No! Lena shouted, yanking him back. Whatever's out there, it's not Mom. It's trying to trick you. Danny hesitated, the logical part of his brain warring with the desperate hope in his chest. Before he could move, the growling returned, low, guttural, and now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The fire flared suddenly, its flames stretching higher than they should have. Shadows danced wildly, twisting into shapes that didn't belong to the trees. Get to the car! Lena screamed, shoving him toward the trail. The footsteps quickened, closing in from all sides. Danny stumbled, dropping the flashlight as Lena dragged him toward the path. The light rolled, illuminating the edge of the clearing for a brief second. That's when they saw it. A figure stood there, half hidden in the shadows. Its form was wrong, elongated limbs, a hunched back, and a face that seemed to shift and ripple like water. Its mouth opened, too wide, and the howl that escaped was deafening. Danny and Lena ran, the path barely visible in the darkness. The sounds followed them, howls, snarls, and the sickening crunch of branches underfoot. Don't look back! Lena shouted, her voice breaking. Danny couldn't help himself. He glanced over his shoulder, and his heart stopped. The creature was on all fours now, its glowing eyes locked onto him. Its movement was unnatural, jerky, like a puppet being dragged by invisible strings. The car came into view, and they threw themselves inside, slamming the doors. Lena fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking as the engine sputtered to life. The creature stopped at the edge of the tree lean, its glowing eyes fixed on them. For a moment, it simply stood there watching. Then it howled a sound so piercing it shattered the back windshield. Lena hit the gas, the tires kicking up dirt as they sped down the road. Danny didn't look back this time, but the howls followed them, echoing through the hollow long after the creature had disappeared from sight. The next day, the hollow was quiet again, the trail untouched. But Danny knew they hadn't imagined it, and he could still hear the howl, faint and distant, every time he closed his eyes. The last cry lingered, echoing in the ears of the living as the hollow returned to stillness. But even those who barricade themselves from the wilderness will find there's no way out. The cabin stood isolated, miles away from the nearest road, surrounded by dense woods. For Mark and Jenna, it was their sanctuary, a place to prepare for the chaos of the outside world. They'd spent months turning it into a fortress. Thick, reinforced walls, heavy steel shutters for the windows, enough supplies to last them a year. Nothing can get in, Mark said for the 100th time as he set down a box of canned goods. Jenna didn't respond. She stared out the window at the dark forest, her unease growing. Lately, something about the woods felt wrong. She'd seen the animals, deer, raccoons, even a black bear, but they weren't acting like they should. They didn't scatter when she walked outside. They didn't even flinch. They just watched. That night, as the wind howled outside, Jenna lay awake listening. The sound of the wind masked other noises, subtle creaks and faint rustling that made her stomach tighten. Beside her, Mark slept soundly, his snores a steady rhythm. Then she heard it, a sharp, deliberate knock on the front door. Jenna froze. Another knock, louder this time. Her heart pounded as she shook Mark awake. "Mark, someone's at the door," she whispered. Mark groaned, rolling over. "Probably just the wind. Go back to sleep." "No," Jenna insisted. "It's not the wind. Listen." A third knock, followed by silence. Mark sat up, rubbing his eyes. He grabbed the rifle they kept by the bed and moved toward the door. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. Jenna followed anyway, staying a few steps behind him. Mark peered through the peephole, his grip tightening on the rifle. "See anything?" Jenna whispered. He shook his head. "Nothing. But I don't like this." He unlocked the door and opened it just enough to look outside. The porch was empty, the forest beyond cloaked in darkness. The only sound was the wind whistling through the trees. Mark shut the door quickly, bolting it again. Maybe it was an animal, Jenna offered, though she didn't believe it. Mark nodded, but his jaw was tight. Let's try to get some sleep. They returned to bed, but the night brought no rest. The knocking resumed an hour later, louder this time, followed by scratching, long, deliberate scrapes against the door. Jenna clutched Mark's arm. It's not an animal. Mark didn't argue. He grabbed the rifle again and motioned for Jenna to stay put. This time, he didn't bother with the peephole. He yanked the door open, stepping onto the porch. The scratching stopped. The forest was still, the air thick with an unnatural silence. Mark scanned the tree lean, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Who's there?" he shouted. "Show yourself." A low growl came from the shadows. Jenna, watching from the doorway, felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Mark, get back inside," she pleaded. He took a step forward instead, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. The growling grew louder, joined by another sound movement. Something large was pacing just beyond the reach of the light. And then they appeared. Two glowing eyes, amber and unblinking, stared back at him. The growling stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Mark raised the rifle, his hands shaking. "Stay back." The creature stepped closer, revealing a hulking silhouette. It was canine but wrong, its legs too long, its frame too lean. Its fur was dark, blending into the shadows, and its teeth glinted in the faint light. Jenna screamed, pulling Mark back inside. He slammed the door, locking it as the creature lunged, its massive body colliding with the wood. The entire cabin shook. Mark backed away, the rifle clutched tightly in his hands. "It can't get in," he said, his voice trembling. "It can't." The growling outside turned to scratching again, slow and deliberate. Then came another sound, footsteps. Not just one set. Many. Jenna's breath hitched. "There's more than one." The scratching grew louder, circling the cabin. Claws scraped against the walls, the shutters, the roof. The creatures were testing their defenses, searching for a way in. Mark pointed to the basement. "Go, now." They rushed downstairs, barricading the door behind them. The scratching continued above, the sound relentless. Jenna huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees. "This place was supposed to be safe," she whispered. Mark paced, his mind racing. "It still is. They can't get through the shutters. We just have to wait them out." Hours passed. The noises ebbed and flowed. Growls, scratches, the occasional thud of something heavy against the door. Jenna's exhaustion eventually overcame her fear, and she dozed off in the corner. Mark stayed awake, his ears straining for any change. Then he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. The door upstairs creaked open. "No," he whispered, shaking Jenna awake. "They're inside." She bolted upright, her eyes wide with terror. The basement door handle rattled, and the sound of claws scraping against wood grew louder. "They found a way in," Jenna said, her voice trembling. Mark raised the rifle, aiming at the door as it splintered under the force of the creature's attack. The growling was deafening now, filling the confined space. The door gave way, and the first creature stepped into the basement. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, its teeth bared in a grotesque grin. Mark fired, the shot echoing in the small space. The creature staggered, but didn't fall. It lunged forward, followed by another, and another. The last thing Jenna saw was the glow of their eyes as the basement plunged into darkness. As silence fell over the cabin, the forest reclaimed its grip. For a stranded driver miles away, the shadows wouldn't wait. They would come for him and the stalkers. The road through the forest stretched endlessly ahead, a thin ribbon of cracked asphalt disappearing into the night. Amber's car had broken down hours ago, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere. She cursed under her breath, kicking the flat tire before leaning against the car. Her phone was useless, with no signal and the battery draining fast. She had been waiting for a car to pass, but the road was eerily quiet. Only the occasional rustle of leaves broke the oppressive silence. Then she heard it, a faint, steady patter in the darkness. Footsteps. Amber turned, peering into the forest. The beam of her flashlight cut through the undergrowth, but there was nothing there. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the sound. It was probably just a deer or a raccoon. The footsteps stopped. She exhaled shakily and turned back to the car, popping the trunk to retrieve the jack. As she crouched to examine the flat tire, the footsteps started again, closer this time. Amber froze, her hand tightening around the flashlight. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing into the trees. "Is someone there?" No response. The footsteps resumed, circling the car. They were deliberate, heavy, and unmistakably human. Amber stood quickly, swinging the flashlight in every direction. The beam caught nothing but trees and shadows. "Stay back," she yelled, trying to sound braver than she felt. Her words were swallowed by the night. Then she saw them, two glowing eyes just beyond the tree line. They were low to the ground, unblinking, and fixed on her. A faint growl rumbled through the air. Amber stumbled back toward the car, her heart pounding. "It's just an animal," she whispered to herself. Nothing to panic about, but as she moved, the eyes followed her. A second pair appeared beside the first, and then a third. Her breath hitched. Wolves! But something about them was wrong. Their movements were too synchronized, their eyes too bright. And their growls, they sounded almost deliberate. Amber climbed onto the hood of the car, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The glowing eyes stayed at the edge of the forest, watching. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. No signal, she muttered, her voice cracking. She tossed the phone aside, her mind racing. The wolves didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. Then, without warning, the growling stopped. The forest fell silent. Amber's flashlight flickered. She smacked it against her hand, desperate to keep the beam alive. The light steadied just as the wolves stepped out of the trees. They were enormous, their fur dark and matted, their bodies lean and unnaturally long. They moved as one, their glowing eyes locked onto her. Amber screamed, throwing the flashlight at the nearest one. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the creatures for a fleeting moment. They flinched, retreating into the shadows, but their eyes never left her. She scrambled to the car's roof, her hands gripping the edges as the wolves began circling again. Their growls returned, low and rhythmic, almost like they were communicating. "What do you want?" Amber shouted, her voice breaking. The wolves stopped. One stepped forward, its massive paws crunching on the gravel. It tilted its head, its eyes narrowing as if studying her. And then it spoke, a deep, guttural voice that didn't belong to any animal. "Run!" Amber's blood turned to ice. She didn't wait to question it. Sliding off the roof, she bolted into the forest, her feet pounding against the ground. The wolves howled behind her, their cries echoing through the trees. She ran blindly, her lungs burning, her legs trembling. The forest closed in around her, the branches clawing at her skin. The howls grew louder, closer, until they were all she could hear. Finally, she burst into a clearing, collapsing onto the ground. She turned back, expecting to see the wolves charging toward her, but the forest was empty. The howls had stopped. Amber tried to catch her breath, her body shaking with exhaustion and fear. She glanced around, her eyes adjusting to the moonlight. The clearing was silent, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. Then she saw it, a single set of footprints leading toward her. They were massive, more human than wolf, but elongated and wrong. Amber's scream caught in her throat as the shadows around her began to move. The wolves stepped into the clearing, their glowing eyes now joined by something larger, something that loomed over them like a master commanding its pack. It smiled, a grotesque, inhuman grin. You shouldn't have run. The headlights dimmed, and the footsteps faded into the forest. But beneath the earth, something ancient and insatiable would stir, drawn out by careless hands and buried hunger. The excavation site wasn't on any map. That was the point. Hidden deep within the Ozarks, it had been marked as a potential indigenous burial ground. a discovery that could rewrite local history. Dr. Evelyn Carter had been leading the dig for weeks, and the air buzzed with the kind of excitement only archaeologists could feel. But something about this site felt off. Evelyn couldn't place it. The others didn't seem to notice, too focused on the dig. They joked, dug, cataloged, and argued, but Evelyn kept finding herself drawn to the woods just beyond the site. The forest seemed alive, its towering trees leaning as if listening. The quiet felt unnatural. No birds, no wind, just the muffled sound of tools breaking the earth. Then, 2 days ago, the first skeleton was uncovered. "It's not like anything I've seen before," Carter said, crouched over the remains. The skull was elongated, the jaw unnervingly wide. The teeth, jagged and oversized, were more animal than human. "They're ceremonial," one of her assistants, Tom, had insisted. Filed to look intimidating. It's not unheard of, but Evelyn wasn't convinced. There was something unnatural about the bones, an energy that made her skin crawl. Still, they continued the excavation, unearthing more skeletons in tight, circular patterns, as if they'd all been buried together. That night, Evelyn stayed late at the site alone. The others had gone back to the camp, leaving her to sift through the remains. The portable lights cast long shadows over the open pits, and the smell of disturbed earth hung heavy in the air. She was cataloging a fragment of bone when she heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the deepest pit. Evelyn froze, the pencil in her hand slipping. "Tom," she called, though she knew no one was there. The scratching stopped. She stared into the darkness of the pit, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Nothing. Shaking her head, she returned to her work, chalking the noise up to her imagination. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural sound, a growl. Evelyn stood, her breath catching in her throat. The pit was silent again, but the unease was unbearable now, pressing against her like a physical weight. She turned to leave, but a faint movement in the corner of her eyes stopped her. The dirt in the pit, it was shifting. "Impossible," she whispered, leaning closer. The earth bulged, cracking open like a wound. Something beneath the soil moved, clawing its way upward. Evelyn stumbled back, dropping her flashlight. It rolled, casting erratic beams across the pit. A hand burst through the dirt, long, skeletal, with claws that gleamed in the dim light. Evelyn screamed, scrambling backward as the creature emerged. Its face was a grotesque blend of human and animal, its jaw impossibly wide, its teeth gleaming. Hollow eyes burned with an unnatural light. It let out a shriek that echoed through the forest, and suddenly the quiet was gone. The woods came alive with noise, snarls, growls, and the sound of movement. Evelyn realized with horror that the other pits were shifting too. Dozens of skeletal figures clawed their way out of the earth, their movements jerky and unnatural. They moved with purpose, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Evelyn bolted, her boots slipping on the loose dirt. She didn't look back, the sound of scraping bones and guttural growls spurring her forward. She reached the camp, breathless, and burst into the main tent where Tom and the others were gathered. "They're alive," she gasped. "The graves, they're moving. We have to leave." Tom frowned. "What are you talking about?" Before she could answer, the noise reached them, a guttural, inhuman cry that made the tent walls tremble. The group fell silent, their eyes wide with fear. Tom grabbed a flashlight, his face pale. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "No." Evelyn grabbed his arm. "You don't understand. We woke something up. We can't fight it. We have to run." Tom shook her off and stepped outside. Seconds later, his scream pierced the night. The others froze, and Evelyn backed away toward the tent's rear entrance. "We're leaving. Now." But it was too late. The skeletal figures emerged from the shadows, their hollow eyes glowing, their claws dripping with soil. They moved with terrifying speed, surrounding the camp. One of the creatures lunged, its claws tearing through canvas as if it were paper. Evelyn grabbed a lantern and swung it, the flame barely keeping the creature at bay. "This way," she shouted, leading the group into the woods. The forest was alive now, the sounds of growls and snapping branches all around them. Evelyn could feel the creatures closing in, their unnatural cries growing louder. She didn't know how long they ran, only that the group grew smaller with every minute. One by one, her colleagues were pulled into the darkness, their screams abruptly silenced. Finally, she stumbled into a clearing, collapsing onto the ground. The world spun around her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. The forest fell silent again. Evelyn looked up, her vision blurred. The skeletal figures stood at the edge of the clearing, their glowing eyes fixed on her. Behind them, the largest figure emerged, its grotesque form towering over the others. It opened its mouth, and a voice that sounded like stone scraping against stone filled the air. "You unearthed us. Now you feed us?" Evelyn's scream was swallowed by the dark. The ground settled, the whispers silenced, but the forest held its secrets tightly. In a fog-shrouded path, glowing eyes would wait for their next victim in eyes in the fog. The fog rolled in faster than anticipated, thick and cloying, reducing visibility to just a few feet. Amanda tightened her grip on her younger brother Will's hand, her flashlight barely cutting through the gray shroud that surrounded them. "I told you we should have turned back earlier," Amanda muttered, her voice trembling. Will frowned, his breath visible in the cold air. "We're not lost. The trailhead has to be close," but Amanda wasn't so sure. The Appalachian woods were unyielding even on clear days, and the dense fog twisted the trees into eerie shapes, making the familiar path feel foreign and unrecognizable. Worse still, the silence was oppressive. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, no distant owl calls. Just their footsteps, crunching over damp earth. "What time is it?" Amanda asked, trying to sound casual. Will pulled out his phone, the screen casting a faint blue glow. 6:45. "We've still got daylight." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Wait, did you hear that?" Amanda stopped, her heart skipping a beat. "Hear what?" Will tilted his head, his brows furrowed. It sounded like footsteps. Amanda swept her flashlight across the fog, the beam reflecting off nothing but swirling mist. "It's probably just an echo. Let's keep moving." They pressed on, but the uneasy feeling clung to Amanda like a second skin. The fog seemed alive now, shifting and curling around them as if watching their every move. And then it came, a sound so faint it could have been imagined. A soft whisper. Amanda froze, yanking Will to a stop. "What was that?" Will scanned the fog, his voice barely a whisper. "It's probably the wind." "There's no wind," Amanda snapped, her voice louder than she intended. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. "Help me." Amanda's blood ran cold. The voice was faint, distant, but undeniably human. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Will nodded, his face pale. "Someone's out here." The voice called again, tinged with desperation. "Please, I'm lost." Amanda hesitated. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but if someone was truly lost in the woods... "Hello?" Amanda called, her voice trembling. "We're here. Where are you?" Silence. Then the voice replied, closer now. "Here?" The single word sent chills down her spine. It was wrong. Flat and hollow, devoid of emotion. Amanda's flashlight trembled in her hand as she scanned the fog. "Maybe we should go back," Will whispered, his voice tight. Amanda nodded, fear tightening her chest. They turned, retracing their steps, or so they thought. The fog twisted the path into an endless maze, the trees blurring together into indistinct shapes. And then they saw it, two eyes, glowing faintly in the fog, hovering just above the ground. "Is that an animal?" Will stammered, gripping Amanda's arm. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared. Amanda swallowed hard, raising her flashlight higher. "Hello," she called, her voice cracking. The eyes flickered and disappeared. "What the hell was that?" Will hissed. Before Amanda could answer, another pair of eyes appeared, larger, closer. Then another, and another. A chorus of glowing eyes surrounded them, some low to the ground, others impossibly high in the air. Amanda and Will huddled together, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. "Stay close," Amanda whispered, her voice barely audible. The eyes began to move, gliding silently through the fog. They circled the siblings, slow and deliberate, like predators toying with their prey. A guttural growl broke the silence, so low it seemed to vibrate through the ground. Amanda turned, her flashlight catching a fleeting glimpse of something massive, a hulking shape, its limbs too long, its form distorted by the fog. "Run!" Amanda screamed, grabbing Will's hand. They sprinted through the forest, the fog closing in around them. The glowing eyes followed, darting between the trees, their movements impossibly fast. Amanda's lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, Will's grip slipping from her hand. "I can't," Will gasped, stumbling. Amanda grabbed him, pulling him back to his feet. "Don't stop!" The growls grew louder, closer, until Amanda could feel the vibrations in her chest. She risked a glance back and saw the shapes emerging from the fog. They weren't animals. They weren't human. They were something else entirely. Twisted skeletal forms with glowing eyes and mouths that stretched too wide. The trail finally appeared ahead, a faint strip of dirt cutting through the endless gray. Amanda and Will ran toward it, their legs screaming with effort. The creatures didn't follow. As soon as they reached the trail, the growls ceased, and the forest fell silent once more. Amanda collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, while Will leaned against a tree, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "Well, what were those things?" Will whispered. Amanda shook her head, unable to speak. The fog lingered behind them, thick and impenetrable, as if the creatures were waiting just beyond the edge. They didn't wait to find out. Without a word, they followed the trail back to their car, the glowing eyes haunting their every step in the corners of their vision. Even as they drove away, the fog seemed to cling to them, curling around the car like it wasn't finished with them yet. And when Amanda glanced in the rearview mirror, she swore she saw the glowing eyes staring back. The fog dissipated, leaving the woods eerily quiet. But in a forgotten grove, the forest's hunger would come alive, exacting its price and feast of the forgotten. The dense forest loomed over the group of hunters, its towering pines casting long shadows across the damp earth. Max adjusted his rifle, glancing back at his companions. 5 of them in total, seasoned hunters who had made this yearly trip into the Colorado wilderness a tradition. "Let's split up," Max said. "Cover more ground before nightfall." The others agreed, their voices low, muffled by the oppressive silence of the forest. The air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, though the sky remained clear. Max couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Don't wander too far," he warned, though his words felt hollow. These men weren't novices. They knew the dangers of the wilderness, or so they thought. Max moved west, his boots crunching softly on the undergrowth. He kept his rifle at the ready, eyes scanning for movement. Hours passed, but the woods offered nothing. No deer, no rabbits, not even the rustle of squirrels in the trees. It was unnatural. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Max stumbled upon a clearing. At its center stood a massive, ancient oak tree, its roots sprawling like veins across the forest floor. Surrounding the tree were bones, hundreds of them, bleached white and arranged in intricate patterns. Max's stomach churned. He stepped closer, crouching to examine the macabre display. The bones weren't just from animals. They were human. Skulls, ribs, and femurs lay scattered among antlers and jawbones, all meticulously placed. The air grew colder, and a faint, low hum began to vibrate through the clearing. Max stood, his breath visible in the sudden chill. "Guys," he called, his voice echoing weakly. No response. The hum grew louder, resonating in his chest. Max turned to leave, but his boots felt rooted to the ground. The shadows around the clearing deepened, and the forest seemed to shift, closing in on him. Then he heard it, the faint sound of whispers, growing louder with each passing second. They didn't come from one direction, but from everywhere at once. Max spun, his rifle raised, but the clearing was empty. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep and guttural, yet eerily calm. "You have taken too much." Max's breath hitched. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The shadows moved. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, their forms skeletal but draped in tattered remnants of flesh. Their empty eye sockets glowed faintly, and their mouths stretched unnaturally wide. Max backed away, his rifle shaking in his hands. "Stay back." The figures didn't respond. They moved with eerie grace, stepping over the bones as if they belonged to them. One raised a skeletal hand, pointing directly at Max. "You feast on us now. We feast on you." Max fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the forest, but the bullet passed through the figure harmlessly, shattering a skull behind it. The whispering grew louder, drowning out his panicked breaths. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. The whispers followed, accompanied by the sound of rattling bones and snapping twigs. "Help!" Max screamed, his voice cracking. He burst into another clearing where the rest of the group had gathered. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. At the center of the clearing stood the same ancient oak tree, surrounded by the same bone arrangements. "This isn't possible," one of the hunters, Carter, muttered. "We didn't come this way." Max didn't have time to explain. The skeletal figures emerged from the forest, their glowing eyes fixed on the group. "Run!" Max yelled, but it was too late. The figures moved faster than any human could, their bony hands clawing at the hunters. One by one, they fell, their screams cut short as the figures dragged them toward the tree. Max fired again and again, but the bullets did nothing. He turned to flee, but the ground beneath him shifted. Roots burst from the soil, wrapping around his ankles and pulling him to the ground. He struggled, clawing at the dirt, but the roots tightened, dragging him closer to the tree. The whispers filled his ears, words he couldn't understand but felt deep in his bones. The last thing he saw was the massive oak, its gnarled branches reaching toward the darkening sky. The next morning, the forest was quiet again. A single hunter's rifle lay abandoned in the clearing, surrounded by the scattered remains of a new pattern of bones. The forest had fed, and it was silent once more. As the last scream faded into the grove, the forest grew still again. Yet beneath the surface, roots twisted and reached for their next prey in the root of fear. The trail was barely marked, little more than a ribbon of dirt winding through the dense Virginia forest. Claire had been hiking alone since dawn, chasing solitude after a long week in the city. The fresh air and towering trees were a welcome reprieve from the suffocating grind of her daily life. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, she began to regret her decision to take the unmarked path. The forest here was different, too quiet, too still. The usual chatter of birds and rustling of leaves had disappeared, replaced by an unsettling silence. Claire paused, adjusting her pack and glancing at her phone. No signal, of course. The map app was useless this deep in the woods. She cursed under her breath, deciding to head back before darkness fell completely. She turned and froze. A root, thick, gnarled, and impossibly long, was stretched across the path where it hadn't been moments ago. Claire stared at it, her stomach twisting. It looked ancient, its bark cracked and covered in dark moss, almost as if it had grown out of the earth in an instant. Shaking her head, she stepped over it, telling herself she'd simply missed it before. The forest seemed darker now, the trees casting jagged shadows that stretched like claws across the ground. Then she heard it, a faint creaking sound, like wood bending under immense pressure. It came from behind her. Slowly, she turned, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The root had moved. It was closer now, curling slightly, as if it were alive. Claire's breath quickened. "No," she whispered, backing away. "That's not possible." But the root shifted again, unmistakably this time, dragging itself toward her with a scraping sound that made her skin crawl. She stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. Another creak came from her left, then another from her right. More roots were emerging from the ground, twisting and stretching like hungry fingers. The earth groaned as they pulled free, their bark splitting to reveal jagged edges that gleamed in the fading light. Claire turned and ran. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees leaning impossibly close, their branches tangling overhead. The roots followed, their movements slow but deliberate, curling and twisting in her path. She tripped over one, her knees slamming into the dirt. Pain shot through her legs, but she scrambled to her feet, heart pounding as the roots crept closer. They were massive now, their bark cracked and oozing a dark, sap-like substance. The ground shook beneath her, and she heard a deep, guttural sound, something between a groan and a growl. It wasn't just the roots. It was the forest itself. It was alive, and it wanted her. Claire's breathing was ragged as she broke into a clearing. At its center stood a massive tree, its trunk wide enough to dwarf any she'd ever seen. Its roots sprawled outward, disappearing into the dark soil, and its bark seemed to pulse faintly like a heartbeat. The roots surrounding her stopped, as if waiting. Claire didn't move. Her eyes were drawn to the base of the tree, where the soil shifted and bulged. Slowly, something began to rise from the ground, a shape that made her stomach churn. It was a face, twisted and grotesque. The face was etched into the bark, its eyes hollow and its mouth frozen in a scream. Dozens of other faces began to emerge, each more horrifying than the last, their expressions locked in agony. The tree groaned again, and the roots lunged. Claire dodged, her instincts taking over as she sprinted toward the edge of the clearing. The roots chased her, snapping and twisting, tearing through the earth like living tentacles. She spotted a break in the trees, a faint sliver of light that could only mean the trailhead. Summoning every ounce of strength, she ran for it, the roots thrashing behind her. She broke through the tree line, collapsing onto the gravel path. Her lungs burned, and her vision blurred, but she didn't stop. She ran until the forest was a distant memory. It wasn't until she reached her car that she dared to look back. The forest was still again, the trees motionless, the roots nowhere in sight. But Claire knew. It was waiting. The forest had let her go, but not because it couldn't take her. It had chosen not to this time. As she drove away, her rearview mirror caught a glimpse of the trailhead. A single root stretched across the entrance, its dark surface gleaming in the fading sunlight. The roots settled, the forest returning to an uneasy quiet. But high on Black Ridge, a family would find that even elevation can't escape the forest's reach in the Black Ridge. The mountain cabin had seemed like the perfect escape. Isolated on the edge of Black Ridge, it offered endless views of the Appalachian wilderness and the kind of peace the Cooper family desperately needed. Sarah and Jack had moved in with their 9-year-old son, Caleb, hoping to start fresh after a turbulent year. But the peace didn't last. It started with the noises. At first, it was subtle, the sound of something moving in the woods at night. Jack had dismissed it as deer or raccoons, but Sarah wasn't so sure. The sounds were too deliberate, too heavy. Caleb swore he'd seen something at the edge of the tree line one evening, but when Jack investigated, there was nothing there. By the third night, the unease had settled over the cabin like a storm cloud. That night, Sarah was the first to hear it, a low, guttural growl, vibrating through the floorboards. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding as she strained to hear. The sound came again, closer this time, as if circling the cabin. "Jack," she whispered, shaking her husband awake. "Do you hear that?" Jack groaned, sitting up groggily. "What is it?" Before she could answer, a loud thud echoed through the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of scratching against the walls. Jack grabbed the flashlight and rifle he'd kept by the bed. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. "No way," Sarah replied, pulling on her robe. "If something's out there, I'm not letting you go alone." They crept downstairs together, the old wooden floor creaking under their weight. Caleb's bedroom door was ajar, and Sarah peeked inside. He was still asleep, his small form curled under the blankets. The scratching grew louder as they reached the living room. Jack flipped on the porch light, but it barely penetrated the inky darkness beyond the cabin's walls. He opened the door cautiously, the flashlight beam sweeping across the yard. Nothing. Sarah stepped out behind him, the cold night air biting at her skin. "It's too quiet," she whispered. Jack nodded, his grip tightening on the rifle. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, frogs, the rustle of leaves, were absent. The silence was oppressive, pressing against them like a physical force. Then they saw it. A massive shadow moved at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the light. It was low to the ground, its movements unnaturally smooth, almost liquid. Two glowing eyes blinked in the darkness, fixing on them. Jack raised the rifle. "Get inside," he said, his voice tight. Before Sarah could respond, the shadow disappeared, melting into the forest like smoke. The growl returned, louder now, resonating through the cabin walls. Jack fired into the darkness. The gunshot echoed through the night, but the growl didn't stop. If anything, it grew deeper, more menacing. Sarah pulled Jack back inside, slamming the door and locking it. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Jack didn't answer. He checked the locks on the windows, his eyes darting nervously. "Whatever it is, it's not an animal." The scratching resumed, this time on the roof. Caleb woke up screaming, and Sarah ran to his room, pulling him into her arms. "It's okay," she whispered, though her own fear was mounting. "We're safe." But she didn't believe it. The scratching turned into pounding, as if something massive was walking on the roof. The walls shuddered, and dust rained down from the ceiling. Jack aimed the rifle at the front door, his jaw clenched. "If it comes in, I'll take it down." Sarah wanted to believe him, but the thing outside wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something unnatural. The pounding stopped. Silence fell over the cabin, broken only by Caleb's soft sobs. Sarah stroked his hair, her heart racing as she waited for the next attack. But it didn't come. Jack lowered the rifle, exhaling slowly. Maybe it's gone? Then the power went out. The cabin plunged into darkness, and Caleb clung to Sarah, his small hands trembling. Jack grabbed a lantern, the flickering flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. The growl came again, impossibly loud, reverberating through the cabin. The floorboards creaked as something massive moved outside, its weight shaking the entire structure. The front door splintered, and Jack fired. The muzzle flash illuminated the creature for a split second, enough to burn the image into Sarah's mind. It was massive, its body a grotesque blend of fur and muscle, with limbs too long and a mouth full of jagged teeth. Its glowing eyes locked onto them, filled with a malevolent intelligence. Jack fired again, but the creature didn't flinch. It lunged, smashing through the remnants of the door. "Run!" Jack shouted, shoving Sarah and Caleb toward the back door. They ran, the lantern swinging wildly in Sarah's hand. The growls and snarls behind them grew louder, and she dared a glance back. The creature was inside the cabin now, tearing through furniture and walls as if they were paper. They burst into the night, the cold air biting at their skin. The forest was a maze of shadows, but Sarah didn't stop. She held Caleb close, her legs burning as she sprinted down the mountain trail. Jack stayed behind, his shouts and gunshots fading into the distance. Sarah wanted to go back, but the look in Jack's eyes had been clear. He was buying them time. The growl stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Sarah and Caleb reached the base of the ridge as dawn broke. She turned back, her chest heaving, but the cabin was out of sight. The forest was still, the trees standing like silent witnesses. But she knew the thing wasn't gone. It was watching, waiting, and it wouldn't stop until it had them all. The ridge returned to its eerie calm, but deep in the forest, an unmarked trail waited for the footsteps of the unwary in dead trail. The sign had been simple: unmarked trail, enter at your own risk. It was weathered, its letters faded, but Sam couldn't resist the allure of exploring the unknown. He'd been hiking solo for years, priding himself on finding hidden paths and forgotten places. This one, deep in the Smoky Mountains, was a challenge he couldn't pass up. The trail was narrow and overgrown, winding through dense forest that seemed untouched by time. The canopy above blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving the ground below cloaked in perpetual shadow. Sam moved carefully, his boots crunching over twigs and leaves. An hour in, he started to notice something strange. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the occasional rustle of small animals had vanished. The only sound was the faint whisper of the wind through the trees. Sam paused, his heart beating faster. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following him. But the trail behind him was empty. "Get a grip," he muttered, shaking his head. Still, the unease lingered, prickling the back of his neck. The trail led him deeper into the woods, where the trees grew unnaturally close together. Their gnarled branches twisted like skeletal arms, blocking out what little light remained. Sam felt as though the forest was closing in on him. Then he saw the footprints. They were faint, pressed into the soft earth, and clearly human. But they weren't fresh. The edges were blurred, as though they'd been there for weeks, untouched by rain or wind. Sam knelt, examining them closer. The size was strange, too large for an average man, with an odd shape that didn't quite fit a boot. The toe marks were elongated, almost claw-like. A chill ran down his spine. He straightened quickly, scanning the forest. The trail ahead seemed darker now, the shadows deeper. Sam debated turning back, but his pride wouldn't let him. "Just a trail," he muttered. "Nothing to be scared of." But as he continued, the footprints became more erratic. They zigzagged across the trail, disappearing and reappearing in a way that made no sense. At one point, they seemed to double back on themselves, leading in circles. The air grew colder, biting at his exposed skin. Sam pulled his jacket tighter, his fingers brushing the small hunting knife on his belt. The unease had turned into full-blown dread. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft rustling, just beyond the tree line. Sam froze, straining to hear. The rustling stopped. He stepped forward cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. "Hello," he called, his voice trembling slightly. No response. He moved on, but the rustling started again, this time closer. He spun around, his flashlight sweeping over the trees. The beam caught movement, a fleeting shadow that disappeared almost as soon as he saw it. "Who's there?" Sam demanded, his voice louder now. Silence. Then he heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like breathing. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sam's grip tightened on the flashlight, his pulse racing. The trail ahead twisted sharply, and as he rounded the corner, he stopped cold. A figure stood in the middle of the path. It was human-shaped but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its eyes glowed faintly, catching the light like an animal's. Sam stepped back, his breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move. It just stared at him, unblinking. "Stay back," Sam warned, drawing his knife. His voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the dense forest. The figure tilted its head further, its mouth opening in a wide, jagged grin. A sound escaped it, a laugh, but distorted, broken, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Sam turned and ran. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees blurring together as he sprinted. The laughter followed him, echoing through the forest. He didn't dare look back. Branches clawed at his arms and face, but he didn't slow down. His lungs burned, his legs screaming for rest, but the sound of footsteps behind him kept him moving. Finally, he saw at a break in the trees the faint outline of the main trail. Relief surged through him as he pushed forward, bursting into the open. He collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The forest was quiet again. The laughter was gone. For a moment, he thought he was safe. Then he noticed the footprints. They were in front of him now, leading back into the forest. They hadn't been there before. His blood ran cold as he realized they weren't just leading into the woods. They were circling him. The sound of breathing returned, louder this time. Sam turned slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The figure was there, standing just a few feet away. Its grin was wider now, its glowing eyes locked onto him. The last thing Sam saw was the figure lunging toward him, its shadow swallowing the light. The trail returned to silence, its secret kept for another victim. The trail vanished into the undergrowth, leaving no trace of the horrors it had claimed. But even in the safety of a campfire, the cries of the forest would call again in night cry. The campfire crackled, casting flickering light over the faces of the 5 friends gathered around it. The woods surrounding them were pitch black, the stars barely visible through the thick canopy above. It was the perfect setting for a weekend of camping. Remote, peaceful, and completely isolated. "All right," Jake said, leaning back on his log. "Who's got the guts to tell the first scary stories?" Emma groaned, pulling her jacket tighter. "Come on, Jake. Isn't it enough that we're in the middle of nowhere? Do we really need to scare ourselves even more?" Jake grinned. "What's the point of camping if you're not a little scared?" Maya smirked, tossing a marshmallow into the fire. "Fine. How about this? They say there's a pack of wolves in these woods. Only they're not normal. They don't howl like regular wolves. They cry. Like people." Emma rolled her eyes. "Nice try." "No, seriously," Maya insisted. "My cousin heard it once. He swears it sounded like a baby crying, but when he followed the sound, he saw glowing eyes watching him from the trees." Jake leaned forward, his grin widening. "So what did he do?" "He ran," Maya said simply, "and he never came back to these woods." The group laughed nervously, but Emma shifted uncomfortably on her log. The fire seemed dimmer now, the shadows around them deeper. "Relax, Em," Jake said. "It's just a story. Maybe," Emma muttered. "But can we not talk about glowing eyes and crying wolves while we're stuck out here?" The conversation moved on, but the unease lingered. The woods felt heavier, the air colder, as if the forest were pressing closer. The fire crackled loudly, sending sparks into the air. Then they heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound drifting through the trees. It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable, the cry of a baby. The group fell silent, their laughter dying in their throats. Emma sat up straighter, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Jake chuckled nervously. "All right, Maya, we get it. You're committed to the bit." Maya shook her head, her face pale. "That wasn't me." The cry came again, louder this time, tinged with a strange, almost mournful quality. It sent chills down Emma's spine. "It's probably an animal," Jake said, his voice lacking its usual bravado. "Bobcats scream, right? Or foxes." "That doesn't sound like an animal," Emma whispered. The group stared into the darkness, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows. The crying continued, growing closer with each repetition. It was louder now, almost human. "We should check it out," Jake said, standing and grabbing a flashlight. "Are you insane?" Emma hissed. "If it's real, what if it's dangerous? And if it's not, what if it's something worse?" Jake hesitated, the flashlight shaking in his hand. "We can't just sit here." Before anyone could argue, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. Then came the growl, low and guttural. It rumbled through the woods, vibrating in their chests. It wasn't the growl of a wolf or a bear. It was something deeper, more menacing. The fire flared suddenly, the flames roaring higher than they should have. Shadows danced wildly across the trees, and Emma thought she saw movement, something large and fast, darting just beyond the firelight. "What the hell was that?" Maya whispered, her voice trembling. Jake aimed the flashlight into the woods, but the beam revealed nothing. The growling continued, joined by the sound of snapping branches and something heavy moving through the underbrush. "We need to leave," Emma said, grabbing her backpack. "Now!" The group scrambled to their feet, their nerves fraying. The growling grew louder, circling the campsite. Glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, first one pair, then two, then four. They hovered just above the ground, unblinking. "Wolves," Jake said, his voice breaking. "It's just wolves," but Emma knew it wasn't. The eyes didn't belong to any wolf she'd ever seen. They glowed too brightly, and the shapes moving in the shadows were too large, too distorted. One of the creatures stepped into the firelight. Its body was low and muscular, its fur matted and dark. But its face was wrong. Its eyes burned with intelligence, and its mouth opened in a grotesque grin. And then it cried. The sound was high-pitched and unnatural, like a baby's wail twisted into something monstrous. It echoed through the woods, joined by the cries of the others. The group bolted, abandoning their gear. They ran blindly through the forest, the glowing eyes and cries following them. The creatures were faster, their heavy footsteps growing louder with each passing second. Emma tripped, hitting the ground hard. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she looked around. The others were gone, swallowed by the darkness. The cries stopped abruptly. The silence was worse. Emma turned slowly, her flashlight barely working. The creatures stood in a circle around her, their glowing eyes fixed on her. The leader stepped forward, its grin stretching impossibly wide. It let out one final cry, a sound that echoed long after the forest returned to silence. By morning, the campsite was empty. Only the smoldering ashes of the fire remained, and the faint outline of footprints leading deeper into the woods. The cries faded into silence, leaving only the darkness to bear witness. Derek leaned on the hood of his car, the only sound around him the faint rustling of leaves in the cold evening breeze. His old sedan had broken down on a forgotten stretch of road in the Allegheny forest. The headlights flickered weakly, casting dim light onto the empty asphalt, and his phone, of course, had no signal. "Great," he muttered, kicking the flat tire. He popped the trunk, pulling out a spare that looked almost as worn as the one it was meant to replace. A quick glance at the surrounding forest made his skin crawl. The trees were impossibly tall, their twisted branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward the dimming sky. He grabbed the jack, but as he crouched by the wheel, he heard it, a faint sound like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. He froze, the tool in his hand trembling slightly. "Hello," he called, his voice cutting through the stillness. No answer, just the wind whispering through the pines. Shaking his head, Derek went back to work, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping over him. But the footsteps came again, louder this time, deliberate and slow. He stood, flashlight in hand, and swept the beam across the trees. "Nothing. You're imagining things," he muttered, trying to convince himself. But his heart told a different story, pounding against his ribs with every passing second. As he turned back to the car, the sound came again, closer now, accompanied by a faint growl. Derek whipped around, his flashlight beam shaking. His eyes darted between the shadows, catching fleeting glimpses of movement, branches bending, leaves stirring, but no clear shape. Then he saw them, two glowing eyes, low to the ground, reflecting the beam of his flashlight. They blinked slowly, unblinking in their focus on him. Derek's breath caught in his throat. "Wolves," he whispered to himself. "It's just wolves." The eyes didn't move. They watched him, unblinking, as if studying him. Then, slowly, a second pair appeared beside the first. Then a third, and a fourth. Derek stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice trembling. He grabbed a wrench from the trunk, gripping it tightly. The eyes didn't flinch. Instead, they began to move, spreading out, circling him. The growling grew louder, and Derek could feel the vibrations in his chest. "Get a grip," he muttered, backing toward the car. He swung the flashlight wildly, but the beam barely pierced the darkness. One of the creatures stepped forward, its shape barely visible in the dim light. It was large, its body low to the ground, with fur that seemed to ripple unnaturally. Its mouth opened, revealing sharp, glinting teeth. Derek bolted. He ran down the road, his breath coming in short gasps. The footsteps followed, faster now, pounding against the ground. The growling turned into a strange, guttural sound that almost sounded like laughter. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees bending unnaturally, their branches tangling together like claws. Derek didn't dare look back. He focused on the road ahead, on the faint hope of finding another car, another person, anything. But the sound of footsteps never wavered. They stayed behind him, unrelenting, closing the distance with every passing second. Derek's legs burned, his lungs screaming for air, but he didn't stop. Finally, he saw it, a faint light ahead, a cabin, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. Derek pushed himself harder, his vision blurring as he reached the door. He pounded on it desperately. "Help, please," he shouted. "They're coming." The door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged man with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He took one look at Derek and pulled him inside, slamming the door shut. "What's out there?" the man asked, locking the door. "I don't know," Derek gasped, collapsing onto a chair. "Wolves or something worse." The man's face paled. "You shouldn't have run. Now they'll never stop." Before Derek could ask what he meant, the growling returned, louder than ever. The cabin shook as something massive slammed against the walls. The man raised his rifle, his hands steady despite the terror in his eyes. "They're not wolves," he said. "They're hunters, and we're their prey." The windows shattered, and the door splintered under the force of the attack. Derek barely had time to scream before the glowing eyes flooded into the cabin, and the world dissolved into darkness. By morning, the cabin was empty. Only claw marks on the walls and faint footprints in the dirt remained, leading back into the forest. The forest claimed another victim, its silence swallowing all traces. In a lone ranger station, the watchers in the woods would make themselves known as silent watchers. The ranger station sat alone at the edge of the Smoky Mountains, its weathered exterior blending into the dark forest behind it. Elena had taken the night shift, a decision she was already regretting as the hours dragged on. The only company she had was the static-filled radio and the endless rustling of leaves outside. She sipped her coffee, staring at the map of the trails pinned to the wall. The radio crackled occasionally with updates from other stations, but the forest was quiet. Too quiet. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sam, her coworker. "Any action out there tonight?" She typed back, "All clear." Boring as hell. As she hit send, a faint sound caught her attention. A steady tap, 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 like something knocking against the station's wooden exterior. She froze, her eyes darting to the door. "Probably just a branch," she muttered, trying to convince herself. But when she stepped outside with her flashlight, the forest greeted her with its oppressive stillness. The tapping had stopped. The beam of her flashlight swept over the clearing. The trees loomed, their branches intertwining like twisted fingers. Nothing moved. Satisfied, Elena returned inside, locking the door behind her. She settled back into her chair, but the unease lingered. The tapping started again. This time it was louder, more deliberate, coming from the far side of the building. Elena's pulse quickened as she grabbed her flashlight and stepped out again. The night felt colder, the air heavier. She rounded the station, the beam of her flashlight flickering over the wooden walls. There they were, footprints in the dirt, leading away from the station and into the forest. They were large and deep, as if made by something heavy. But the shape was all wrong, elongated, with clawed toes that dug into the earth. Elena crouched, her breath visible in the cold night air. What the hell? A twig snapped behind her. She spun, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The forest stared back at her, silent and unyielding. But she knew she wasn't alone. She could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes watching her from the shadows. "Elena," she whispered to herself, "go inside. Now!" She backed toward the station, keeping her flashlight aimed at the tree line. Her heart raced as the darkness seemed to shift, shapes moving just beyond the beam's reach. Inside, she bolted the door and grabbed the radio. "Station Alpha to HQ. I've got something out here. Over." The radio crackled, but no response came. Only static. The tapping returned, louder than ever, this time from the windows. Elena's head snapped toward the sound. Two faint glowing orbs appeared just beyond the glass. Eyes, reflecting the dim light from inside. She stumbled back, knocking over her chair. The eyes didn't move. They stared at her, unblinking, as if sizing her up. Then they disappeared. Elena's breathing was ragged as she grabbed her rifle. She backed toward the center of the room, every muscle in her body screaming to run. But where would she go? She was miles from help, surrounded by nothing but trees. The tapping moved to the roof. It was heavy now, each thud rattling the walls. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide anymore. It was toying with her. Elena to HQ. She screamed into the radio. "I need backup. Something's attacking the station." The static hissed, and then a voice broke through. "Not alone, leave now, too late." The roof groaned under the weight of something massive. The lights flickered, and Elena aimed her rifle at the ceiling. The sound stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural growl that made her stomach turn. And then the power went out. The station was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from her flashlight. She held it tight, her rifle aimed at the door. The tapping started again, slow and deliberate, circling the building. "Elena," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't panic. Don't!" The door exploded inward. Elena screamed as the flashlight's beam caught a glimpse of the creature. It was tall, hunched, its body a grotesque blend of fur and muscle. Its glowing eyes locked onto her, and its mouth stretched into a jagged grin. She fired, the sound deafening in the confined space. The creature snarled but didn't fall. It lunged, and she barely dodged, the rifle slipping from her hands. She ran, her flashlight swinging wildly as she burst into the night. The forest seemed alive now, the trees twisting and groaning as if to trap her. She could hear the creature behind her, its growls growing louder, closer. Her foot caught on a root, and she fell hard, the flashlight skittering away. She scrambled to her knees, her hands clawing at the dirt as the growls surrounded her. The last thing she saw was a pair of glowing eyes, impossibly close, before the darkness swallowed her whole. By morning, the ranger station stood eerily still. The door hung on broken hinges, the walls scratched and splintered. Inside, the radio crackled faintly, but there was no sign of Elena. Only the faint outline of footprints leading into the forest, too large to be human and too deep to be anything natural. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark and mysterious corners of the forest. Let the rain guide you into restful sleep, and may the whispers of these tales stay safely within the shadows. Sweet dreams if the forest allows them.